In the autumn of 1857, something happened in Little Rock, Arkansas, that the local authorities buried so deep it took over a century for whispers to surface. On Thanksgiving night in what was once the grandest plantation house in Pulaski County, a slave named Samson supposedly killed his master with his bare hands, snapping Colonel Jeremiah Ruddle's neck like a dry twig. But here's what makes this story different from other tales of slave rebellion. Witnesses claimed Samson's strength that night was inhuman, strong enough to crush a man's skull with one hand, bend iron tools into pretzel shapes, and leave handprints pressed so deep into oak beams they're still visible today. The official records were sealed, the witnesses silenced, and the entire incident scrubbed from local newspapers. What really happened on Rutledge Plantation that Thanksgiving? And why did 3 separate county officials spend the rest of their lives claiming that what they saw that night defied all natural explanation? Before we continue with the story of Samson and the secrets buried beneath Rutledge Plantation, if you're fascinated by these forgotten chapters of American history, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because tonight's tale might be closer to your hometown than you think. The story begins in the heart of Arkansas Territory, 20 miles south of Little Rock, where the Arkansas River carved its lazy path through some of the richest bottomland cotton country in the South. By 1857, Rutledge Plantation had grown to encompass over 3,000 acres, worked by nearly 200 enslaved souls who lived in the shadow of Colonel Jeremiah Ruddle's imposing Greek revival mansion. Rutledge himself was a man of contradictions, a Massachusetts-born lawyer who'd moved south in his 20s, drawn by the promise of easy wealth in cotton speculation. Unlike many plantation owners who were born into the system, Rutledge had chosen it, and perhaps because of that choice, he ruled his property with a methodical cruelty that shocked even his neighbors. He kept meticulous records of punishments, maintained detailed breeding charts for his human property, and was known throughout Pulaski County for his scientific approach to slave management. The enslaved community at Rutledge Plantation lived in 2 distinct quarters: the field hands in rough Hune cabins near the river and the house servants in slightly better accommodations closer to the main house. It was a world of whispered conversations, hidden knowledge, and survival strategies passed down through generations. The older slaves spoke of better times under Ruddle's predecessor, a gentler man who'd sold out when the colonel arrived with northern capital and southern ambitions. Among this community, Samson stood apart, not because of his size, though at 6 feet 4 inches and he towered over most men of his era, but because of his strange history. Rutledge had purchased him 3 years earlier from a bankrupt plantation in Louisiana, and the bill of sale listed unusual details: strong constitution, unusual physical capabilities, possible medical anomaly. Buyer assumes all risks. The seller, a Frenchman named Boudreau, had been eager to part with Samson, despite his obvious value as a field hand. Samson never spoke of his previous life, but the other slaves noticed things. He could work 16-hour days in the cotton fields without showing fatigue. He could lift cotton bales that normally required 2 men. His hands, when examined closely, showed calluses so thick and developed they looked almost like horn. The plantation blacksmith, an enslaved man named Jupiter, swore that Samson could bend horseshoes with his bare hands, though he was careful never to display such abilities where the overseer might see. But it wasn't just physical strength that set Samson apart. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a literacy carefully hidden that suggested education far beyond what any slave was permitted to possess. Late at night, some claimed to see him scratching symbols in the dirt outside his cabin. Not English letters, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like formulas. Colonel Rutledge took a particular interest in Samson, though not out of kindness. The colonel had heard rumors about the slave's unusual capabilities and saw an opportunity for both profit and scientific inquiry. Rutledge fancied himself a man of learning, a subscriber to phrenology journals and agricultural periodicals that discussed the natural variations in human specimens. He began conducting what he called strength assessments on Samson, timing his work, measuring his output, and documenting his capabilities in leather-bound journals kept locked in his study. These sessions took place in the Plantation's old carriage house, away from prying eyes. Rutledge would have Samson lift increasingly heavy objects, anvils, tree trunks, even sections of iron machinery while he took notes and made calculations. The colonel was particularly fascinated by what appeared to be Samson's ability to work without fatigue, often pushing him for hours beyond the point where normal men would collapse. By autumn of 1857, these assessments had taken on a darker tone. Rutledge had begun inviting guests to witness what he called his demonstrations. Wealthy planters from neighboring counties who came to see the slave who could allegedly perform feats of impossible strength. Some of these demonstrations involved lifting contests. Others required Samson to bend iron bars or break thick wooden planks with his bare hands. But as Thanksgiving approached, something began to change in Samson's demeanor. The other slaves noticed at first a tension in his movements, a distant look in his eyes, as if he were calculating something. Jupiter, the blacksmith, later told investigators that Samson had begun asking strange questions about the plantation's layout, about Colonel Ruddle's habits, about which of the house servants had access to which parts of the mansion. The Rutledge household was preparing for what the colonel planned to be his grandest Thanksgiving celebration yet. He'd invited over 40 guests from as far away as Memphis and New Orleans, including several who'd specifically requested to see his remarkable specimen. The menu had been planned for weeks, with special delicacies ordered from as far away as Baltimore. Most importantly, Colonel Rutledge had planned a special after-dinner demonstration featuring Samson, one that he promised would astound his guests and cement his reputation as Arkansas's most forward-thinking plantation owner. What Rutledge didn't know was that Samson had been listening. The house servants, moving invisibly through the mansion as they prepared for the celebration, had overheard conversations about the planned demonstration. More disturbing still, they'd glimpsed some of Colonel Ruddle's private journals, left carelessly open in his study. The entries they'd seen spoke of terminal experiments and ultimate strength limitations and acceptable losses in the name of scientific advancement. As Thanksgiving Day 1857 dawned crisp and clear over the Arkansas bottomlands, both Colonel Rutledge and Samson were making their final preparations. Neither man knew that before the night was over, one of them would be dead and the other would vanish into the Arkansas wilderness, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Pulaski County for generations to come. November 26, 1857 began like any other Thanksgiving at Rutledge Plantation, but the undercurrents of tension were impossible to ignore for those who knew where to look. By dawn, the mansion's kitchen was alive with frantic preparation as house slaves worked under the watchful eye of Molly Crittenden, the head cook, preparing a feast that would seat 50 guests in the plantation's grand dining room. Samson had been assigned to help prepare the grounds, setting up additional seating on the mansion's wraparound veranda and ensuring the oil lamps were properly filled and positioned for the evening's entertainment. But those who worked alongside him noticed something different, an economy of movement, as if he were conserving his strength for something specific. His usual willingness to take on the heaviest tasks had been replaced by a careful calculation of effort that seemed almost strategic. Colonel Rutledge spent the morning in his study, reviewing his notes and preparing for what he'd privately dubbed the grand demonstration. His journals from that day, discovered decades later during the mansion's demolition, revealed his excitement about showing his guests what he believed would be the ultimate proof of his theories about human physical limitations. The final entry written in his careful script that morning read, "Today I shall push the specimen beyond all previous thresholds. Science demands nothing less than complete understanding." The guests began arriving around noon, their carriages creating a steady stream along the plantation's Oak Line Drive. Among them were some of the most prominent names in Arkansas society. Judge Cornelius Dillingham from Little Rock, plantation owner Samuel Vaughn from Helena, and Dr. Nathaniel Peton, a physician from Memphis who'd gained notoriety for his writings on racial physiognomy. But the guest who drew the most attention was Professor Emanuel Voss, a German immigrant who claimed expertise in what he called physical anthropology and who traveled from as far as St. Louis to witness Ruddle's famous slave. As the afternoon progressed and the guests enjoyed their pre-dinner drinks on the veranda, Samson continued his preparations with the methodical precision of a man following a carefully rehearsed plan. Jupiter the blacksmith later told investigators that when he tried to engage Samson in conversation around 3 o'clock, the larger man had looked at it with eyes that seemed to see right through him, as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. The dinner itself proceeded without incident. The guests feasted on roasted turkey, sugar-cured ham, cornbread stuffing, and an array of seasonal vegetables, all prepared by skilled hands, who move invisibly between kitchen and dining room. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, with discussions of cotton, prices, territorial politics, and the growing tensions between North and South that would explode into war just 4 years later. But as the evening wound toward its climax, Colonel Rutledge stood to address his guests, his face flushed with wine and anticipation. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation, "tonight you will witness something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of human capability. My specimen, Samson, will demonstrate feats that would have been considered impossible just a generation ago." The guests followed Rutledge out to the old carriage house, their voices excited and skeptical in equal measure. Torches had been arranged around the building's perimeter, casting dancing shadows against the weathered wooden walls. Inside, the space had been clear except for an array of testing apparatus, iron bars of various thicknesses, wooden beams, and what appeared to be sections of railroad iron arranged on heavy wooden blocks. Samson was already waiting inside, his massive frame silhouetted against the torchlight, but something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, the angle of his head suggested a readiness that went beyond mere physical preparation. Dr. Peton, the Memphis physician, later wrote in his private diary that looking at Samson that night was like looking at a spring wound to its breaking point, all controlled energy waiting for release. Colonel Rutledge began with his usual demonstrations. Samson lifted weights that should have been impossible for any man, bent iron bars that should have required machinery, and split thick oak beams with his bare hands while the guests watched in amazement. Professor Voss took copious notes, muttering in German and occasionally asking Rutledge to repeat certain tests. But as the evening progressed, Ruddle's demands became more extreme. He ordered Samson to lift heavier weights, bend thicker, iron, break harder wood. The guests, initially impressed, began to show signs of discomfort as they realized they were witnessing what amounted to systematic torture disguised as scientific inquiry. It was Judge Dillingham who first noticed a change in Samson's expression. Around 10:30, as Rutledge ordered him to attempt lifting what appeared to be a section of railroad rail, something shifted in the slave's demeanor, the careful compliance, the measured responses, all of it vanished, replaced by something that made the judge step backward involuntarily. "Colonel," Dillingham said quietly, "perhaps we've seen enough for one evening." But Rutledge, caught up in the excitement of his demonstration and the attention of his guests, waved off the suggestion. "Nonsense. We're just reaching the truly interesting thresholds. Samson, I want you to attempt something we've never tried before." He gestured toward a massive piece of machinery that had been moved into the carriage house earlier that day, the iron flywheel from a cotton gin, weighing easily 400 pounds. For a long moment, Samson stared at the flywheel, then at Colonel Rutledge, then at the circle of expectant faces surrounding them. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that several guests had to lean forward to hear him. "No, sir." The simple refusal hit the gathering like a physical blow. In the antebellum South, a slave's direct refusal of a master's command was unthinkable. A violation so complete it demanded immediate and violent response. But something in Sampson's tone, in the way he held himself, gave everyone pause. Colonel Ruddle's face went through a spectrum of emotions, surprise, anger, and finally a cold fury that his guests had never seen before. "What did you say?" "I said no, sir." Sampson's voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now, something that made Professor Voss stop, writing in his notebook, and Judge Dillingham take another step backward. "You will do as I command," Rutledge said, his voice tight with rage. "Or you'll face consequences that will make our previous session seem like gentle encouragement." For a moment that stretched into eternity, the two men faced each other across the torchlit space. Then Sampson smiled, and several of the witnesses later swore that they'd never seen an expression more terrifying in their lives. "No, sir," he said one final time. "I don't believe I will." What happened next unfolded with a speed that left most witnesses struggling to process what they'd seen. Sampson moved toward Colonel Rutledge with the fluid grace of a man half his size, covering the distance between them in 3 impossibly quick strides. Rutledge had time to raise his hands defensively, time to open his mouth in what might have been a shout or a plea, but no time to escape what was coming. The sound that followed, described by multiple witnesses as resembling a thick branch breaking in a strong wind, would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge, master of 3,000 acres and nearly 200 human souls, died instantly as his neck snapped with an audible crack that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. But it wasn't just the killing that terrorized the witnesses. It was the ease of it. Sampson had killed his master with no more effort than a normal man might use to break a stick for kindling. For a moment that felt frozen in time, he stood over Ruddle's body, his massive hands still positioned as if he were holding something delicate that had simply broken. Then he looked up at the circle of horrified faces, and when he spoke, his voice carried an intelligence and education that no slave was supposed to possess. "Gentlemen," he said with perfect diction and a slight accent that none of them could identify, "I suggest you leave now." The stampede that followed was anything but dignified. Prominent citizens of Arkansas society trampled each other in their haste to escape the carriage house, abandoning all pretense of social standing in their panic to reach their carriages and flee into the night. Within minutes, Rutledge Plantation was empty except for the slaves in their quarters, the body of their former master and Sampson, who stood alone among the scattered testing apparatus and flickering torches. What happened in the hours that followed remains one of the great mysteries of that terrible night. The house slaves, terrified and uncertain, remained in their quarters until dawn. When they finally emerged, they found the carriage house empty, the torches burned out, and Colonel Ruddle's body gone. Sampson had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only the deep handprints pressed into the oak beams, where he'd demonstrated his strength, and a plantation full of people who suddenly found themselves without a master, without direction, and without any idea what came next. But the disappearance of Sampson and the body was only the beginning. Within hours, riders were dispatched to Little Rock. Telegrams were sent, and officials began arriving at the plantation. What they found launched an investigation that would consume the local authorities for months and leave questions that remain unanswered to this day. The immediate aftermath of that Thanksgiving night created chaos throughout Pulaski County. By dawn of November 27th, word had spread to the network of plantation owners, overseers, and county officials who formed the backbone of Arkansas society. The implications were staggering, not just because a slave had killed his master, but because of how completely Sampson had vanished and how traumatized the witnesses had become. Judge Cornelius Dillingham, one of the most respected legal minds in the state, returned to Little Rock in a state that his clerk described as complete nervous prostration. Dr. Nathaniel Petton, the Memphis physician, checked himself into a private sanitarium and refused to speak about the events for over a year. Professor Voss simply disappeared, abandoning his hotel room and leaving behind only a trunk full of notes. written in what appeared to be a mixture of German and some form of mathematical notation that no one could decipher. Sheriff Thomas Brieg arrived at Rutledge Plantation at first light, accompanied by a contingent of armed deputies and several volunteer militia members from Little Rock. What they expected to find was a crime scene, evidence of violence, possibly an ongoing slave revolt, certainly some trace of where Samson might have fled. Instead, they discovered something far more unsettling, a plantation where life seemed to have simply stopped. The house. Slaves, when questioned, provided accounts that were maddeningly consistent and completely unhelpful. Yes, they had heard raised voices from the carriage house around 10:30. No, they had not investigated. Slaves learned early not to interfere in their master's business. Yes, they had seen lights moving around the plantation late into the night, but from their quarters they couldn't determine who might have been carrying them or where they were going. Most frustrating of all, when pressed about Samson himself, the slaves seemed almost unable to provide useful descriptions. He was tall, they agreed. He was strong. Certainly, but when asked about his personality, his habits, his relationships with other slaves, they became vague and evasive in ways that suggested either deliberate concealment or genuine confusion about who Samson had really been. Jupiter, the plantation blacksmith, proved to be the most forthcoming witness, though his testimony raised more questions than it answered. Under pressure from Sheriff Brieg, he admitted that Samson had possessed unusual strength far beyond what any normal man should have been capable of, but when pressed for specifics, Jupiter's account became increasingly strange. He could work all day without getting tired. Jupiter testified, his hands twisting nervously in his lap, but it wasn't natural tired. You understand? It was like he was powered by something different than the rest of us. And sometimes late at night, I'd see him doing things that didn't make sense. What kind of things? Sheriff Brieg pressed. He'd be working with numbers, scratching them in the dirt, but they weren't like any numbers I ever seen. And sometimes he'd be talking to himself, but not in English, in something else. Something that sounded. Jupiter hesitated, clearly struggling with how to describe what he'd observed. Something that sounded like he was giving orders, not just talking, like he was used to being in charge of things. The physical evidence at the plantation was equally baffling. The carriage house showed clear signs of the previous night's activities. Scattered weights, bent iron bars, broken wooden beams, but there was no blood despite the violent nature of Colonel Ruddle's death. There were no clear footprints leading away from the building, despite the soft earth that should have preserved tracks. Most mysteriously, there was no body. Sheriff Brieg organized search parties that combed the Arkansas bottomlands for miles in every direction. They dragged ponds, searched abandoned buildings, followed every creek and river in a 20 m radius. But Samson seemed to have vanished as completely as morning mist, leaving behind no trace of his passage. The investigation took on an increasingly desperate quality as days turned into weeks. Governor Elias Conway, under pressure from prominent plantation owners throughout the state, authorized a reward of $500 for information leading to Samson's capture, an enormous sum that drew bounty hunters from as far away as New Orleans and Memphis. Wanted posters appeared throughout the Arkansas Territory and neighboring states, featuring a description so generic it could have applied to dozens of men. Large Negro male, approximately 6 feet 4 inches in tall, unusually strong build. Answers to the name Samson, extremely dangerous, approach with caution. But as the weeks passed, a more troubling pattern began to emerge. Several of the bounty hunters who'd taken up the search reported strange encounters in the Arkansas wilderness. Glimpses of an impossibly tall figure moving through the forests at night. Campsites that appeared to have been occupied by someone of enormous strength. Trees that had been uprooted or bent in ways that suggested superhuman force. More disturbing still were the reports that began filtering in from other parts of the state. A plantation owner near Pine Bluff reported that his slaves had begun acting strangely, whispering among themselves and showing signs of what he called dangerous excitement. Another planter near Helena claimed that his overseer had quit suddenly after reporting that the slaves were talking about someone called the Strong Man who was coming to set things right. By Christmas of 1857, the Sampson investigation had become something of an embarrassment to Arkansas law enforcement. Despite the massive manhunt, the substantial reward, and the involvement of federal marshals, they were no closer to finding their fugitive than they had been on Thanksgiving night. Worse, the case was beginning to attract unwanted attention from northern newspapers, which had begun running sensationalized accounts of the Arkansas Superman who had supposedly killed his master and vanished into thin air. It was during this period that the first attempts at official cover-up began to emerge. Governor Conway, concerned about the impact on Arkansas's reputation and the potential for the case to inflame tensions between North and South, quietly ordered all official records of the investigation sealed. The reward was withdrawn, the wanted posters removed, and newspapers were discouraged from running further stories about the case. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source, Colonel Ruddle's personal papers. When his estate was finally settled in early 1858, his executives discovered something that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. Hidden in a false bottom of the colonel's desk was a collection of documents that suggested his interest in Sampson had gone far beyond simple scientific curiosity. Among these papers was correspondence with several northern universities, including detailed discussions about human experimentation and physical enhancement studies. There were receipts for chemical compounds ordered from laboratories in Boston and New York, substances with names that meant nothing to local investigators, but suggested medical or scientific applications. Most intriguingly, there was a bill of lading from a shipping company in New Orleans dated just 2 weeks before Sampson's arrival at the plantation for what was described as specialized pharmaceutical equipment and associated materials. The final document in this hidden collection was perhaps the most disturbing, a contract with a company called Meridian, research associates based in Boston for what was described as ongoing physiological assessment and enhancement protocols. The contract was signed by both Colonel Rutledge and someone identified only as Subject SN, handwriting that several of the house slaves identified as belonging to Sampson himself. These discoveries raised questions that no one in Arkansas was prepared to answer. Had Sampson been part of some sort of medical experiment? Had Colonel Rutledge been working with northern interests to develop new forms of human enhancement? And if so, what did that mean for understanding the events of Thanksgiving night 1857? The official response to these revelations was swift and decisive. The documents were classified as sensitive estate, materials sealed by court order and transferred to federal custody. The executives were sworn to secrecy. The house slaves who had identified Sampson's handwriting were quietly sold to plantations in distant states, and all mention of Meridian Research Associates were scrubbed from official records. But rumors persisted, spreading through the underground networks that connected slave communities throughout the South. Stories of the strong man who had broken his chains and disappeared into legend, tales of government experiments and northern conspiracies, whispers about other plantations where similar specimens might be undergoing similar treatments, and what might happen if they, too, decided they'd had enough. As 1858 dawned over Arkansas, the Sampson case officially no longer existed, but in slave quarters throughout the South, in the private correspondence of worried plantation owners, and in the locked files of federal offices in Washington, the questions raised by one Thanksgiving night continue to multiply, and somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Arkansas Territory, those who claimed to have seen him insisted that Sampson was still out there growing stronger, biding his time, and possibly planning something that would make his actions at Rutledge Plantation seem like just the beginning. Spring of 1858 brought new developments that would deepen the mystery surrounding Sampson's disappearance and raise questions about the true nature of what had occurred at Rutledge Plantation. The first indication that the case was far from closed came from an unexpected source. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, which had been quietly hired by parties unknown to conduct their own investigation into the events of Thanksgiving night. Alan Pinkerton himself arrived in Little Rock in March, accompanied by two of his most experienced operatives. Unlike the local authorities who had focused their efforts on tracking Sampson's movements after the killing, the Pinkertons were interested in what had happened before his arrival at Rutledge Plantation. Their investigation would uncover a trail that stretched back through Louisiana, Mississippi, and eventually to a series of medical facilities in the Northeast that had been conducting what they euphemistically called human improvement research. The Pinkerton investigation began with the original bill of sale that had brought Sampson to Arkansas. Detective James Hawthorne, posing as a potential slave buyer, traveled to Louisiana to interview the original seller, the Frenchman named Budrow. What he discovered was deeply unsettling. Budrow's plantation, located in the bayou country south of New Orleans, had been the site of extensive medical experiments conducted under the opax of what was called the Southern Health Initiative. The program, ostensibly designed to study diseases common among enslaved populations, had actually been testing various chemical compounds in medical procedures designed to enhance human physical capabilities. The Frenchman was nervous from the moment I mentioned Sampson's name. Hawthorne wrote in his confidential report to Pinkerton. He kept insisting that he had disclosed all known risks in the bill of sale, that he bore no responsibility for what happened afterward. But when pressed, he admitted that Sampson had been part of what he called the enhancement protocol for over 2 years before the sale. According to Budrow, the Southern Health Initiative had been funded by a consortium of northern investors who were interested in developing more efficient labor systems. The experiments involved exposing subjects to various chemical treatments, carefully monitored exercise regimens, and what were described as nutritional optimization protocols. Most subjects showed modest improvements in strength and endurance. A few showed dramatic changes, and a very few, like Sampson, began to display capabilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. But there were side effects. Budrow had confided to the Pinkerton detective. The enhanced subjects began to show signs of independence. They became harder to control, more questioning of authority, and some of them began to display intellectual capabilities that were most disturbing. Sampson was among the worst or the best, depending on your perspective. He learned to read and write within months, began to understand complex mathematical concepts, started asking questions about the nature of the treatments he was receiving. The Louisiana experiments had been shut down abruptly in 1854 when several enhanced subjects had escaped during a revolt that left 3 overseers dead. Most of the escapees had been recaptured and quietly disposed of, but a few, including Sampson, had been sold to distant plantations with carefully worded disclaimers about their unusual characteristics. This revelation led the Pinkertons to investigate the northern connections to the Southern Health Initiative. What they discovered was a network of medical facilities, research institutions, and private laboratories that had been conducting similar experiments throughout the 1840s and 1850s. The work was funded by a combination of private investors, government contracts, and what appeared to be military interests seeking to develop enhanced soldiers for potential future conflicts. The central figure in this network was Dr. Marcus Kleinman, a German immigrant who had established research facilities in Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Kleinman's work focused on what he called human optimization using a combination of chemical treatments, physical conditioning, and psychological conditioning to create individuals with enhanced capabilities. His test subjects were drawn from prisons, immigrant populations, and increasingly enslaved individuals purchased specifically for experimental purposes. Detective Sarah Chun, one of Pinkerton's most skilled female operatives, infiltrated Kleinman's Boston facility by posing as a nurse seeking employment. Her reports revealed the scope and sophistication of the enhancement program. The facility maintains detailed records on over 200 subjects who have undergone various levels of enhancement treatment. She wrote, the success rate varies dramatically depending on the subject's physical condition, psychological profile, and what they refer to as genetic compatibility factors. Successful subjects show increases in physical strength ranging from 50% to, in extraordinary cases, over 300% of baseline human capability. But the most disturbing discovery came from Chen's access to Kleinman's private correspondence. The doctor had been in regular communication with Colonel Rutledge, receiving detailed reports on Sampson's progress and providing guidance on how to maximize the subject's capabilities. More alarming still, the letters revealed that Rutledge's Thanksgiving demonstration had been planned in coordination with Kleinman as the ultimate test of Sampson's enhancement. The subject has reached the limits of our current understanding. One of Kleinman's letters read, "The demonstration you have planned will provide crucial data about the psychological breaking points of enhanced subjects. We must understand what happens when they are pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The implications for future military applications are enormous." The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Jupiter, the plantation blacksmith, who had maintained contact with several of the Pinkerton operatives through a network of free blacks in Little Rock. In late April, Jupiter provided information that suggested Sampson had not simply vanished, but had been preparing for his escape for months. He had been making arrangements, Jupiter revealed during a clandestine meeting. There were people who knew about him, people who had been waiting for the right time. The night he killed the colonel wasn't random. It was planned, and there were others involved, people who helped him get away. This revelation led to a broader investigation of what appeared to be an underground network dedicated to helping enhanced subjects escape from their captivity. The network, which called itself the Freedom Chain, included abolitionist free blacks and even some sympathetic whites who had become aware of the enhancement experiments and viewed them as an abomination that went beyond even the normal horrors of slavery. The Freedom Chain had been operating since the early 1850s, helping escaped enhanced subjects reach safe havens in Canada, Mexico, or remote areas of the American wilderness. They had developed sophisticated methods for covering tracks, providing false identities, and most importantly, helping the enhanced subjects learn to control their abilities in ways that would allow them to blend into normal society. But the most shocking revelation came in May of 1858, when Detective Hawthorne uncovered evidence that the Freedom Chain had been infiltrated by foreign agents. Documents found in a raid on a suspected safe house in Memphis revealed correspondence with British and French intelligence, operatives who were interested in learning about American enhancement technologies. The implications are staggering. Pinkerton wrote in his final report to his mysterious clients, "The enhancement program has not only created individuals with capabilities that exceed normal human limitations, but it has also attracted the attention of foreign powers who see potential military applications. If subjects like Sampson have been successfully extracted to foreign territory, we may be facing a situation where America's enemies possess capabilities that we do not fully understand or control." The Pinkerton investigation was quietly terminated in June of 1858, its findings classified and its operatives reassigned to other cases. But the questions it had raised continued to reverberate through certain circles in Washington, where military officials and government researchers began to grapple with the implications of what they had learned. Meanwhile, reports continued to filter in from throughout the Arkansas Territory and beyond. Sightings of an impossibly tall, impossibly strong figure moving through the wilderness. Stories from remote settlements about a mysterious benefactor who had helped escaped slaves reach freedom. Tales from Native American tribes about a man who could outrun horses and bend iron with his bare hands, but who spoke with intelligence and kindness rather than the savage fury that many expected from someone of his capabilities. And in the ruins of what had once been Rutledge Plantation, now abandoned and slowly being reclaimed by the Arkansas wilderness, visitors reported strange phenomena Deep handprints in oak beams that seemed to grow more distinct rather than fading with time. Areas where the very ground seemed to have been compressed by enormous force. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind was still, the sound of someone moving through the old carriage house, as if a massive figure were testing his strength against invisible weights. As summer gave way to autumn in 1858, 1 year after the Thanksgiving night that had changed everything, the mystery of Samson had evolved from a local manhunt into something much larger and more complex. The questions were no longer just about where he had gone, but about who he really was, what had been done to him, and what his escape might mean for a nation that was already fracturing along lines of slavery, freedom, and the fundamental question of what it meant to be human. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Arkansas intensifies. If the story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the most terrifying revelations are yet to come. The autumn of 1858 brought a series of incidents that would forever change how the Samson case was understood and feared by those in positions of power. What began as isolated reports of strange occurrences throughout Arkansas and neighboring states gradually coalesced into a pattern that suggested something far more organized and dangerous than a single fugitive slave hiding in the wilderness. The first major incident occurred in October near the town of Camden in southern Arkansas. A plantation owned by Marcus Henley, one of the state's most prominent cotton producers, experienced what witnesses described as a night of impossible terror. Henley had recently acquired 3 new slaves from a Louisiana dealer, men who bore the same mysterious markings in their bill of sale that had once described Samson: unusual physical capabilities and possible medical anomaly. On the night of October 15th, these 3 men, identified in plantation records only as Caesar, Goliath, and Titan, simultaneously broke free from the plantation's most secure holding facility. But this wasn't a typical escape attempt. According to surviving overseer James Huckabe, the 3 men didn't break the locks on their shackles. They broke the shackles themselves, twisting solid iron bands apart with their bare hands as if they were made of clay. I've been managing slaves for 20 years, Huckabe testified to investigators, and I've never seen anything like what happened that night. These men moved like they could see in the dark, coordinated like they'd been planning this for years instead of days. And the strength, God help me, the strength was inhuman. The 3 enhanced slaves had systematically destroyed every piece of restraint equipment on the plantation, not just their own bonds, but every chain, every lock, every iron bar that could be used to confine human beings. They had accomplished this destruction in complete silence without waking the house slaves or alerting the guards until they were ready to leave. When they finally departed, they took with them not just their own freedom, but detailed maps of the local area that they had somehow acquired, along with supplies that suggested they were planning a much longer journey than a simple escape to the next county. But the Camden incident was just the beginning. Within weeks, similar reports began arriving from plantations throughout the region. In Mississippi, 2 enhanced subjects escaped from a research facility near Natchez, leaving behind equipment that had been twisted into abstract sculptures of bent metal and broken wood. In Louisiana, a group of 4 enhanced individuals broke free from what was supposed to be an escape proof-holding facility, but not before systematically destroying every document and research note related to the enhancement program. The pattern was clear and terrifying. The enhanced subjects weren't just escaping randomly. They were being coordinated, directed by some central authority that knew exactly where they were being held and exactly how to free them. More disturbing still, they seemed to possess intelligence about the enhancement program itself, targeting specific facilities and destroying specific types of evidence with precision that suggested inside knowledge. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, the German researcher who had been instrumental in developing the enhancement protocols, arrived in Little Rock in November to consult with federal authorities about the growing crisis. His assessment was grim and increasingly panicked. "We are dealing with subjects who have been fundamentally altered, not just physically but intellectually," he reported in a classified briefing to military officials. The enhancement process appears to have created individuals with capabilities that extend far beyond our original parameters. They are displaying strategic thinking, coordination abilities, and problem-solving skills that suggest we may have inadvertently created a form of enhanced intelligence. Kleinman's most disturbing revelation concerned the psychological profiles of enhanced subjects. According to his research, the chemical and physical treatments that increase their strength and endurance also appear to break down certain mental barriers that normally limited human potential. Enhanced subjects showed increased memory capacity, faster learning abilities, and most troubling of all, what appeared to be a form of shared consciousness that allowed them to coordinate their actions across vast distances. "We believe," Kleinman admitted in a classified report, "that we may have accidentally created a new form of human being, one that views ordinary humans not as equals, but as inferior. The implications for social control for the entire structure of our society are catastrophic." Meanwhile, the search for Samson himself had taken on new urgency as authorities began to suspect that he was not just another escaped subject, but possibly the coordinating intelligence behind the growing network of enhanced individuals. Reports from throughout the Arkansas Territory describe sightings of an impossibly tall figure who appeared at plantations and research facilities in the days before mass escapes occurred, as if he were conducting reconnaissance missions to plan future operations. Thomas Bogard, a bounty hunter who had been tracking enhanced subjects since the Camden incident, provided the most detailed account of an encounter with what he believed was Samson himself. In late November, while following tracks near the Buffalo River in northern Arkansas, Beauregard claimed to have come face-to-face with a fugitive in a remote canyon. He was standing on a ledge about 30 feet above me. Beauregard reported to federal marshals, and I knew immediately that this wasn't someone I could take alive. The size of him was inhuman. He had to be close to 7 foot tall and built like he could tear a tree out of the ground. But it wasn't his size that scared me. It was his eyes. He looked at me like he was calculating exactly how long it would take to kill me and whether it was worth the effort. According to Beauregard, Samson had spoken to him in perfect English with an accent that suggested extensive education. He told me that I was hunting the wrong prey. The bounty hunter recalled. He said that men like him weren't the problem. We were. He said that for too long people had been treated like property, like animals to be experimented on and discarded. He said that was going to change whether we wanted it to or not. The encounter had ended without violence, but only because Samson had chosen to leave rather than fight. He just stepped backward off that ledge, Beauregard reported, and when I climbed up to see where he'd gone, there was nothing, no tracks, no sign he'd ever been there. Just those deep handprints in the rock where he'd been gripping the stone. By December of 1858, the enhanced subject situation had escalated to the point where President James Buchanan was receiving regular briefings about what his advisors had begun calling the Samson crisis. The implications were staggering, not just for the immediate security concerns, but for the broader questions about human experimentation, states' rights, and the fundamental nature of freedom and slavery that were already tearing the country apart. Military officials began developing contingency plans for what they called enhanced subject containment operations, but their planning was complicated by a disturbing realization. They had no clear understanding of exactly how many enhanced individuals had been created over the years, where they all were, or what their ultimate capabilities might be. The various research programs had been conducted in secret with minimal coordination and virtually no central record keeping. "We may be facing a situation," wrote General Winfield Scott in a classified memo to the War Department, "where our own scientific ambitions have created a threat that we are fundamentally unprepared to address. These enhanced subjects appear to possess not only superior physical capabilities, but also tactical intelligence that makes them extremely difficult to track or contain. If they are indeed being coordinated by a central authority, possibly the Samson figure, then we may be dealing with what amounts to an insurgency led by individuals who are virtually superhuman. The final incident of 1858 occurred on New Year's Eve at a remote research facility in eastern Tennessee. The facility operated under military OPACs and hidden in the Cumberland Mountains had been conducting enhancement experiments on volunteer soldiers who had been promised improved strength and endurance in exchange for their service. The program had been so classified that even President Buchanan was unaware of its existence. On the night of December 31st, the facility was attacked by what survivors described as a coordinated force of enhanced individuals led by someone matching Samson's description. The attack was not a chaotic assault, but a precisely planned military operation that suggested extensive reconnaissance and tactical planning. They knew exactly where everything was, reported Major William Crittenden, the facility's commanding officer. They disabled our communications first, then systematically destroyed all research materials and freed subject. The entire operation took less than 2 hours, and they accomplished it without killing a single person, though they made it very clear that they could have eliminated all of us if they had chosen to do so. The most disturbing aspect of the Tennessee raid was the message left behind, carved into the facility's main laboratory wall in letters 2 in deep, was a declaration that would haunt government officials for years to come. The chains are broken. The strong shall no longer serve the weak. A new age begins. The message was signed with a single symbol, a representation of broken shackles that investigators would later discover had appeared at every site where enhanced subjects had escaped or been freed. It was becoming clear that what had begun as isolated incidents of individual escapes had evolved into something much more organized and dangerous, a coordinated uprising led by individuals whose capabilities exceeded anything in previous human experience. As 1859 dawned over a nation already fracturing along lines of slavery and freedom, the Samson crisis represented a new and unprecedented threat to the established order. The enhanced subjects weren't just seeking their own freedom. They appeared to be working toward the systematic destruction of the entire system of human bondage and experimentation that had created them. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the American frontier, Samson and his growing army of enhanced followers were planning their next move in what was beginning to look less like a series of escapes and more like the opening phases of a war that would challenge everything. Americans thought they knew about human nature, human rights, and the price of treating people as property to be bought as old and modified at will. The confrontation that would finally reveal the full scope of the Samson conspiracy came in the spring of 1859, in a location that no one could have anticipated, the nation's capital itself. What began as a routine investigation into government contracting irregularities would explode into a crisis that reached the highest levels of the federal government and threatened to expose secrets that powerful men had killed to protect. The investigation began when Congressman Joshua Giddings of Ohio, a longtime opponent of slavery, received an anonymous package containing documents that detailed the full extent of the enhancement program. The materials, hundreds of pages of correspondence, financial records, medical reports, and research notes, revealed a network of human experimentation that stretched from the bayous of Louisiana to the laboratories of Boston, all funded through a complex web of government contracts, private investments, and military appropriations. But the most explosive revelation in the documents was a roster of enhanced subjects that had been created over nearly a decade of experimentation. The list contained over 300 names along with their locations, their enhancement levels, and most disturbingly their current status, captured, escaped, or terminated At the top of the list, marked with special notations indicating both the highest enhancement level and active, resistance leader status was a name that had become synonymous with the entire crisis. Sampson Congressman Giddings, recognizing the enormity of what he had received, immediately demanded congressional hearings into what he called the systematic enslavement and torture of human beings in the name of scientific advancement. His demands were met with fierce resistance from Southern representatives who argued that any such investigation would violate states' rights and interfere with legitimate agricultural research. But Giddings had allies among Northern representatives who were equally appalled by the revelations, and by April of 1859, a select committee had been formed to investigate the enhancement program. The committee's first public hearing, held on April 21st, in the Capitol building, drew enormous crowds and unprecedented media attention. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, subpoenaed to testify about his role in the program, provided testimony that shocked even the most prepared observers. The enhancement protocol was originally conceived as a humanitarian effort, Kleinman testified, his German accent thick with emotion. We believed that by increasing the physical capabilities of enslaved individuals, we could reduce their suffering by making their labor more efficient and less physically demanding. We never intended to create what we ultimately produced. Under aggressive questioning from committee members, Kleinman revealed the true scope of the program's evolution. What had begun as attempts to improve physical health and endurance had gradually expanded into full-scale human modification experiments. Enhanced subjects were exposed to increasingly aggressive treatments, pushed to physical and mental limits that no ethical researcher should have, contemplated and ultimately developed capabilities that transcended normal human experience. The subject, designated as Sampson, Kleinman admitted represented our most successful and most dangerous outcome. His physical capabilities were approximately 400% of baseline human norms. His intellectual development exceeded our most optimistic projections, and his psychological profile indicated a level of independence and leadership potential that made him fundamentally unsuitable for continued bondage. But the most damaging testimony came from Dr. Kleinman's admission that the program had been expanded beyond enslaved subjects to include prisoners, immigrants, and eventually volunteer soldiers who had not been fully informed about the risks they were accepting. The enhancement program, originally justified as research on an already oppressed population, had metastasized into a broader system of human experimentation that violated every principle of medical ethics and individual rights. The committee's second day of hearings focused on the military and intelligence applications of the enhancement program. General Winfield Scott, testifying in closed session, revealed that the War Department had been funding enhancement research since 1852 with the goal of creating soldiers who could operate in extreme conditions and perform tasks that were beyond normal human capabilities. The enhanced subjects showed promise for special operations, reconnaissance missions, and combat situations where superior physical capabilities would provide decisive advantages, Scott testified. However, we quickly discovered that the psychological changes that accompanied physical enhancement made these subjects unsuitable for military discipline. They became increasingly resistant to authority, increasingly likely to make independent decisions, and increasingly sympathetic to causes that conflicted with military objectives. Scott's testimony revealed that the military had attempted to create their own enhanced subjects using volunteer soldiers, but the results had been catastrophic. Enhanced soldiers had deserted at unprecedented rates, often taking classified information with them. Several had been court-martialed for refusing orders, and at least 2 had been executed for what amounted to mutiny. The military enhancement program had been quietly terminated in 1857, but not before creating dozens of enhanced individuals whose current whereabouts were unknown. The congressional hearings reached their climax on April 25th when the committee announced that they had received communication from Sampson himself. The message, delivered through intermediaries whose identities were kept secret, was a formal statement that would be read into the congressional record and reported in newspapers throughout the nation. To the representatives of the American people, The statement began, "I write to you not as a former slave, not as an escaped fugitive, but as a free man who has broken the chains that bound not just my body, but my mind and spirit as well. For too long, men like me have been treated as property to be bought and sold, as animals to be bred and modified, as subjects for experiments that no decent society should permit." The statement continued with a detailed account of Samson's experiences in the enhancement program, from his initial capture and sale to his gradual understanding of what was being done to him and others like him. But the most powerful section addressed the broader implications of what the enhanced subjects had discovered about American society. Through the enhancement process, we have gained not just physical strength, but clarity of vision about the true nature of this nation's institutions. We have seen how easily men can be reduced to property when it serves economic interests. We have experienced how readily scientific advancement is used to justify the most degrading forms of human bondage. We have learned that the principles of freedom and equality that this nation claims to uphold are applied selectively based on calculations of power and profit rather than any consistent moral framework. The statement concluded with a declaration that sent shockwaves through the Capitol. We, the enhanced subjects who have broken free from our bondage, do not seek revenge against those who created us. We seek justice. We demand the immediate termination of all human enhancement programs. We demand the freedom of all subjects currently held in research facilities. And we demand recognition of our status as free human beings with rights equal to any other Americans. If these demands are not met, we will take whatever actions are necessary to secure our freedom and the freedom of others like us. The message was signed not just by Samson, but by over 50 other enhanced subjects, creating what amounted to a formal declaration of independence from a group of individuals who possessed capabilities that made them extraordinarily dangerous if they chose to use violence to achieve their goals. The immediate response from Southern representatives was predictable demands that the enhanced subject be hunted down and captured regardless of the cost. But Northern representatives, already sympathetic to abolitionist causes, saw the enhanced subject demands as fundamentally just, even if their capabilities made them frightening. The divide over how to respond to the Samson crisis became yet another factor pushing the nation toward civil war. President Buchanan, facing pressure from all sides, authorized a massive manhunt for enhanced subjects throughout the nation. Military units were deployed to search territories where enhanced subjects were believed to be hiding. Bounties were increased to unprecedented levels, and a special federal task force was created to coordinate the capture or elimination of what government officials were now calling enhanced insurgents. But even as these measures were being implemented, reports began arriving that suggested the enhanced subjects were no longer simply hiding in the wilderness. Sightings were reported near major cities: Washington, Philadelphia, New York, Charleston. Enhanced individuals were apparently conducting reconnaissance missions in urban areas, gathering intelligence about government facilities, military installations, and research centers. The climax of the crisis came on May 15, 1859, when Samson himself appeared in Washington, D.C. He didn't attempt to hide or operate in secret. He walked openly through the streets of the Capitol, his massive frame and impossible height making him unmistakable to anyone who saw him. Witnesses reported that he moved with complete confidence, as if he had no fear of capture or confrontation. His destination was the Capitol building itself, where he requested a meeting with the Congressional Committee investigating the enhancement program. The request was, of course, denied. Samson was a fugitive slave wanted for murder, not a legitimate political representative, but his mere presence in the nation's capital sent a message that was impossible to ignore. The enhanced subjects were no longer running and hiding. They were ready to confront their creators directly. Samson's brief appearance in Washington ended without violence, but not without consequence. Before leaving the Capitol, he left behind one final message carved into the marble steps of the Capitol building itself. The message was brief but devastating in its implications. The experiment is over. The specimens have become the scientists. By evening, Samson had vanished as completely as he had appeared, leaving behind only the deep gouges in marble that demonstrated his superhuman strength and the unmistakable message that the enhanced subjects were no longer content to be victims of other men's ambitions. They had become active, agents in their own destiny, and they possessed the capabilities to challenge anyone who stood in their way. The Samson crisis had reached its ultimate expression, a direct confrontation between the enhanced subjects and the government that had created them. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Samson and his followers, but the future of human experimentation, individual rights, and the fundamental question of what it meant to be human in a nation that was already struggling to define the meaning of freedom. The resolution of the Samson crisis came not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through a series of secret negotiations that would reshape American policy on human experimentation and set precedents that would influence government research for generations to come. The negotiations, conducted through intermediaries and kept hidden from public scrutiny, began in June of 1859 and continued throughout the summer. Even as the nation moved inexorably towards civil war, the breakthrough came when President Buchanan, recognizing that a military solution to the enhanced subject problem would likely result in enormous casualties and unwanted publicity, authorized Secretary of War John Floyd enter into direct communication with Samson and his representatives. The negotiations were conducted through a complex network of intermediaries, including abolitionist leaders who had been secretly supporting the enhanced subjects and federal officials who recognized that the crisis could not be resolved through force alone. Samson's demands, as presented through these intermediaries, were surprisingly sophisticated and legally grounded. Rather than seeking revenge against those who had created and exploited the enhanced subjects, he proposed a comprehensive solution that would address the immediate crisis while establishing principles that would prevent similar situations in the future. The core elements of what became known as the Washington Compact, though no public record of its existence was ever officially acknowledged, included the immediate cessation of all human enhancement research conducted under federal OPACs, the destruction of all research materials and subject records, and the provision of new identities and financial support for enhanced subjects who wish to integrate into normal society. Most importantly, the compact established what amounted to a separate territory in the remote regions of Alaska, then still Russian territory, where enhanced subjects who prefer to live apart from normal society could establish their own communities. The arrangement was facilitated through complex international negotiations that involved Russian officials who were eager to establish American goodwill before the eventual sale of Alaska to the United States. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, whose testimony before Congress had helped expose the full scope of the enhancement program, played a crucial role in the resolution. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, he provided detailed medical information that allowed government doctors to develop treatments for enhanced subjects who wished to reduce their capabilities and integrate into normal society. Not all enhanced individuals chose this option, but those who did were able to live relatively normal lives under carefully constructed new identities. The implementation of the Washington Compact required extraordinary secrecy and coordination. Enhanced subjects throughout the nation were contacted to the underground network that had been helping them evade capture and given choices about their future. Those who chose integration were provided with new identities, financial support, and medical treatment to reduce their enhanced capabilities to more manageable levels. Those who chose separation were transported through a series of carefully orchestrated movements to the designated territory. In Alaska, Samson himself chose separation, but not before ensuring that all other enhanced subjects had been given genuine options for their future. His final communication with federal negotiators, delivered in August of 1859, demonstrated the intelligence and moral clarity that had made him such an effective leader of the enhanced subject. Resistance I have no desire to live among people who view individuals, like me, as either property to be owned or weapons to be controlled, he wrote. But I also have no desire to see unnecessary suffering inflicted on either side of this conflict. The compact we have negotiated provides a path forward that respects the autonomy of all parties while preventing future tragedies. I hope that future generations will learn from the mistakes that created this situation and will treat all human beings with the dignity and respect that every person deserves. The public resolution of the Samson crisis was carefully managed to minimize its impact on national politics and public opinion. The congressional investigation was quietly concluded with a report that acknowledged irregularities in certain research programs but avoided specific details about the enhancement experiments. Dr. Kleinman and other key figures in the program were transferred to remote locations where they could continue medical research under strict supervision, but without access to human subjects. The enhanced subjects who chose integration were scattered throughout the northern states where they lived quiet lives under assumed identities. Many became successful farmers, craftsmen, or small business owners. Their enhanced capabilities, providing advantages that they were careful not to display too obviously. A few became involved in the underground railroad, using their abilities to help other enslaved individuals escape to freedom. Those who chose separation established communities in Alaska that became legendary among the Teredo's indigenous populations for their strength, wisdom, and commitment to justice. These communities maintained contact with each other and with certain government officials, serving as both a reminder of the enhancement program's consequences and a resource that could be called upon in extreme circumstances. The most lasting impact of the Samson crisis was its effect on federal policy regarding human experimentation. The Washington Compact included provisions that established the first formal ethical guidelines for government-sponsored medical research principles that would eventually evolve into the modern system of informed consent and human subject protection. While these guidelines were initially kept secret, they influenced government research practices and helped prevent similar crises in future decades. The Civil War, which began less than 2 years after the resolution of the Samson crisis, overshadowed the enhancement program in public memory. The massive casualties and social upheaval of that conflict made the story of a few dozen enhanced individuals seem relatively minor by comparison. Official records of the program were classified and eventually forgotten, buried in archives that would not be open for over a century. But the impact of Samson and the enhanced subjects extended far beyond the immediate resolution of their crisis. The communities they established in Alaska became centers of learning and technological innovation, developing advanced techniques in engineering, medicine, and agriculture that would eventually benefit the entire territory. Several of the enhanced subjects who chose integration became important figures in the abolitionist movement, using their capabilities and their unique perspective to help end the system of slavery that had made their own exploitation possible. Most importantly, the Samson crisis demonstrated that human dignity and individual rights could triumph over even the most sophisticated systems of oppression and exploitation. The enhanced subjects had not just escaped from their bondage. They had fundamentally challenged the assumptions that made such bondage possible in the first place. As the years passed and the details of the enhancement program faded from official memory, the story of Samson became legend rather than history. But in certain circles, among researchers who studied government ethics, among civil rights advocates who fought against medical exploitation, among indigenous communities in Alaska who remembered the strange but honorable neighbors who had settled among them, the memory of the enhanced subjects served as a reminder of both humanity's capacity for cruelty and its potential for redemption. The handprints that Samson had left pressed into the oak beams of the Rutledge Plantation carriage house remained visible for decades after the building's abandonment, a physical reminder of the night when one man's refusal to accept degradation had sparked a crisis that changed American history. Visitors to the ruins often reported a sense of awe when they saw those marks. Not fear, but recognition of the extraordinary strength that had been required not just to break physical chains, but to challenge an entire system of human exploitation. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors in human history often arise not from supernatural forces, but from the willingness of ordinary people to treat others as less than human when it serves their interests. But it also shows us that human dignity and the desire for freedom are forces more powerful than any enhancement, any system of oppression, or any attempt to reduce people's property. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the archives of our government? Leave your comment below and let us know what you think really happened to Samson and the other enhanced subjects. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden history and human resilience, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who appreciates the complex and often disturbing truths of America's past. There are more forgotten chapters of our history waiting to be explored, and we'll be here to guide you through them. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another mystery that the powerful will prefer to keep buried.